with the Psalms series, and I have chosen Psalm 95. There is so much to this psalm, and it's within a collection from 90 to 100. I'm only going to touch on a few things today, and I hope that that speaks to you. You can always look this up and dive deeper. There is not enough time to cover how much God can speak through his word in any part, but especially this psalm. And I love this psalm. And just as Vicky shared in the very first, it has a lot of singing of sound, of noise in the very beginning of the psalm. And I wanted to show you a video of Gideon as he worships in a way. Yesterday, he was in children's church, and I filmed this video with Vicky. Are we able to play it?
In his?
All right, so in this, he doesn't know every word, but this is like the second or third time that he's heard this song while watching it in children's church. But he focuses on the things that he knows. And so he takes the words that he knows and then he shouts them as loud as he can. And he waits for them to come in the song. And so even as we gather to worship before God's throne, we can be as innocent as Gideon. We don't have to understand everything, but we can sing, we can worship God from what we do understand. It comes with time, more and more understanding of the depth of God. And so this Psalm 95 is attributed to David as the actual author. While some of the Psalms are inspired by him, the New Testament author in Hebrews attributes this directly to David and not just any psalm. The book of Psalms is thought to be compiled over a period of 1,000 years. For those, the book itself of Psalms that we have today, it was compiled for those who had gone to exile from Jerusalem. They had left their home and they were taken to another place. Some into slavery, some just to live in a different culture, a different life, so that they could no longer practice the same things of their own culture. That's the way that Babylon and Assyria and many of them treated the people of Israel after they conquered them. So it's kind of like a prayer book of songs, poetry, and prayers, all to help the people worship and stay true to God when they're far from home and completely out of the normal practice of temple or cultural life. And on the surface, this psalm breaks into two parts. There's a lot more depth, but if you just glance over it, there's the first part, which is a celebration in the Creator God. And then you have the warning on how we should respond to his voice. So let's consider this background as we then read this psalm today. Psalm 95, verse 1 says, "Let us come and sing to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come to him with thanksgiving, and let us sing songs of praise to him. For the Lord is a great God, a great King above all gods. He holds in his hands the depths of the earth and the mightiest mountains. The sea belongs to him, for he made it. His hands formed the dry land too. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people he watches over, the flock under his care. If only you would listen to his voice today." Or in ESV it says, "if you hear his voice today." The Lord says, "Don't harden your hearts as Israel did at Meribah, as they did at Massah in the wilderness. For there your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw everything I did. For 40 years I was angry with them, and I said, they are a people whose hearts turn away from me. They refuse to do what I tell them, so in my anger I took an oath. They will never enter my rest." As Vicky opened the service earlier, it's so wonderful to be in person today, and that's what the first part of this psalm really celebrates, is that us. Let us come and sing. Let us come and remember this rock of our salvation. Shout joyfully. You can even make noise. It takes in all of those who can't carry a tune in a bucket, but who can just make noise. I think Gideon is at that stage right now. But it celebrates that fellowship as an active part of worship before God. And all of this is not based on the state of our world or anything that we came from or the current situation. But we come together to celebrate our God and to humbly worship before him, thanking him for everything he's done, expressing that thankfulness through song, through action. So you can consider someone reading this from captivity or slavery or exile, or even someone confined indoors from the pandemic. It could be the worst scenario we could imagine in our lives right now, or maybe it's just one that we've never faced or can't figure out. But wherever you're coming from today, that joy and celebration can be yours. And you don't have to wait for your life to be fixed and all right together. And last week, we saw in Summer with the Psalms, Christine looked at Psalm 139, and it looked at the amazing God who knows us completely, even better than we know ourselves. I doubt that anyone has gone through and counted the number of hairs that you have before one falls out and then you have to start over again, or one turns gray and you don't want it anymore. Or rather, they know their own heart, and yet God totally loves us and never abandons us. And this always reminds me of Psalm 27:10. It says, "Even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will hold me close." And it's echoed in Isaiah 49:15 and Jeremiah 31:20, as he asks, how could a parent forget their child? But even if that happened, God would still never forget us and never leave us. In Psalm 95, we see the God who holds the universe together, guiding every detail. In 3-7, it says, "The Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods." And I want to make a correction that it's not saying that there are other gods, but instead it's saying the exalted beings. It could be heavenly beings like angels outside of our physical realm, but it could also be people who take high positions. It could be a ruler over many things, or a person or image that is looked up to. So something that is exalted. And in that idea is also someone that God has placed in that position, or someone that people have placed in that position. But they're all under his rule. It says he holds in his hands the depths of the earth and the mightiest mountains. The sea belongs to him, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land too. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people he watches over, the flock under his care. And it seems like David always sneaks in these analogies of the sheep, and I love to look at those. But this passage reminds me of Psalm 147:4 that says he counts the stars and calls them all by name. Every single detail he knows, he holds together, he watches over, he even calls everything by name. He knows each and every detail. And yet, who knows the impact that we would have on the greater universe? Some of us may not even have an impact outside of our neighborhood, outside of our family, and yet God wants to love us and know us intimately and be involved in a relationship with us, every detail of our lives as well. And he has a great plan as our designer for what he wants us to do. He didn't just set a clock and walk away. But he's kind of like one of our architecture students who designed a museum or a place of activity. And he has this great and grand idea for what it's going to be used for and what people are going to see as they come into this place. But what if he then returns and finds it being used as something else? Something like a bar or a restroom, or maybe it was unkept and it's a rubble heap. So I love the poetic imagery that is used throughout the Psalms, but especially in this one, 95, 4-5, saying that he holds in his hands the depths of the earth and the mightiest mountains, the sea and the dry land. In Proverbs 30:4, it says, "Who but God goes up to heaven and comes back down? Who holds the wind in his fists? Who wraps up the oceans in his cloak? Who has created the whole wide world? What is his name and his son's name? Tell me if you know." And that's the church answer, Jesus. But two things to compare these mountains and depths to. The first thing would be they could be the lowest and the highest of people in positions. Like he talked about, that he is king over all gods, quote unquote gods. So Psalm 89, 6-7 would back this up. It says, "Who in all of heaven can compare with the Lord? What mightiest angel is anything like the Lord? The highest angelic powers stand in awe of God. He is far more awesome than all who surround his throne. Another way to see this is the unseen realms, the depths outside our understanding, and the seeable yet out of reach heights. So I studied geology, and we like to dig up stuff. We like to study the things in the deep earth. We have a lot of models of what the inner earth looks like, but few of us have actually seen it, and especially seen it in process. So it's outside our sight, and a lot of it is outside of our understanding. Especially the depths of the ocean are still vastly unexplored, similar to space. And I think of this song that Gideon is singing, that he holds the whole world in his hands. But what do you think about when you hear that song, or you hear the words? He got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. This is the image that I get, the whole world, a globe being held in his hands. But in this image, I think that the furthest you could get away from those hands would be the top or the center. And you have this idea of just a outside presence holding the world in his hands. But the image that this psalm draws for us is much greater. It's inside to outside. It's the depths of the earth and the heights of the mountains. Just as last week in Psalm 139 was illustrated, there's nowhere we could go to escape his presence, his hand. If you sink down to your lowest lows, he's there to catch and pick you up if you ask him. If suddenly you find yourself atop the best part of your life or the insurmountable obstacle in your path, he's there with you to guide you in wisdom if you let him. So then what does it mean to know that he's in control? Gideon and I, during the time that the parks were closed, would go up to the rooftop to get some sun and fun. And as the picture, he had found a bucket that was used for the garden, and he was digging the water out and then spraying it all over the plants and then all over me too. But I realized that Gideon has some sort of fear of heights. If I get him close to the edge, he'll scream and he'll say no. There's only one way that I can get him to look out over the city or down onto the pavement down below. And that's if I hold him in my arms and I stand with my back to those things. So he looks over my shoulder and feels me holding him as he looks out over that. And then he doesn't scream and he doesn't say no. But if I turn around, his immediate reaction is he thinks he's going to be dropped. And it reminds me of a passage in Mark where the disciples were in a real storm. Even the fishermen among them, Peter and James and John, they were terrified. And you know it's bad when a fisherman is terrified of a storm. It reminded me of a t-shirt that I saw that says, I'm a bomb technician. If you see me running, try to keep up. But if a fisherman's afraid of a storm, it's really bad. Mark 4:39 through 40 says, when Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, silence, be still. Suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? So Jesus didn't run from this storm. He didn't run from the problems. He was totally calm. He didn't even shout because he knew all was under God's control. He was able to sleep in this storm. I have a picture of baby Elisha here to make the next statement. We are safe there in his presence. If we allow him to calm us, we can enter this rest that he has for us in our everyday lives. If we remember then why Jesus said he came, in the same passage where he describes himself as a loving shepherd and the only way to the Father in John 10:10, he says, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. In 95:5 says, the sea, it belongs to him, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land too. The ocean at that time was the most vast and incomprehensible thing in their immediate everyday life. In poetry as well as in mythology at the time, the Near Eastern, it was often used to represent chaos. And yet, there that too is in God's hands. And so is the place also where we stand, even where we stand today. It says that he made a place, and we call it dry land, or the earth. He made that place in the midst of this chaos for us to feel safe. And some in our world today don't even see the ocean even all their lives. But others are painfully reminded of its dangers year after year. And he did all this and has all this in his hands, but yet he comes to us and he calls us by name, just as he does the stars. The question the psalmist ends this passage with is, how will we respond? In 95:7, and he ties in both the first verse and then the next part of this passage. He says, if you would only listen, or if you would listen to his voice today, if only you would listen to his voice today. I read it mostly in ESV. It says, if you hear his voice today. But what does that mean for the context and us today? Does it just mean that he's talking about that day? Well, David penned this for the people of God in his day, but he writes about the people that God speaks about in Moses' day. Then the Psalms are compiled for the exiles. It was meant for their day. And then the New Testament writer, he says, we should do this. We should avoid this as long as it is called today. And it's in Hebrews 3 that we were about to look at. But so then can we say that this is for us today? For it is timeless, just as the words of God, who dwells outside of time and is in control of time and space. This verse comes to mind when I hear today, if you hear his voice, also from John 10. It says, he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They will run from him because they don't know his voice. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own sheep, and they know me. So the word today, it doesn't allow for delaying or, as we like to do often, procrastinate. The past and his glory, his power are evident everywhere. That's what this first part of the psalm illustrates. You can see it everywhere. He is the Alpha and the Omega, which means the beginning and the end, because it's taken from the beginning of the Greek alphabet and the end of the Greek alphabet, as we sang, beginning and end. So anyone with an open mind can see that he is the Alpha, the beginning. But who is willing to follow him, to make him their Omega, to follow him to the end? The future is not guaranteed, but today is available for your decision. He calls his people to obedience and pleads for a soft and warm, responsive heart, not a cold stone. As illustrated in the last part of this passage, he brings up these two names for the same place, or the same event that happened. And greater, it would demonstrate and be used to illustrate their whole time in the wilderness, the people of Israel. In Exodus 17 and Numbers 20, if you hone in on verse 7 and 13, respectively, Exodus 17:7, Numbers 20:13, they can tell the whole story of the waters of Meribah, which means to provoke or to tempt God. And Massa, which meaning to test or prove, or even despair, also relating to what they did toward God. And it became a test of faith for both the leaders of the people and the people themselves. No one was excluded from this test of faith. So they had just left Egypt, the people of Israel, a place where they were enslaved, they were forced to work to death. At events in this history, the Egyptian people had even taken their children and killed them in this place. And God had, with many miracles, freed them at last. And they crossed the Red Sea on dry land because God had caused the water to pile up, all of that water from the Red Sea. And then they came to camp in a place without any water. And it didn't take them long to start complaining to Moses. God tells Moses, take the elders of the people, and before everyone there, speak to a rock, and it will gush out water. But how did they fail this test? So first of all, they failed in their disbelief. After seeing all that God did in Egypt and how he rescued them after years of slavery, they begin to grumble when they ran out of water. They even begin to ask, is God really among us? And for us today, the writer brings our attention to God as a creator. So everyone can relate to what we see in nature. We can see what he's already done. Just as the people of Israel could see the great things that he did for them, every person in the world can see already God has made these things, and he causes it to rain, he causes the crops to grow, he causes everything to work together. And that's why I bring up that many people, if with an open mind, can see that he has done the greatest miracles. If he created everything from nothing, then he's capable of anything in all creation. Their second failure was arguing against God and those he placed to lead them. Their third was in anger. They tried to fix something rather than let God be glorified. And you had the anger of the people who wanted to replace God and replace Moses with other leaders. And then you had the anger of Moses, who didn't speak to the rock, but ended up striking it with the staff that God gave him. And in anger, he addressed the people for their rebellion. And you can listen to the heart of God as he expresses it again in another psalm, Psalm 81, 7 through 14, also verse 16. He says, you cried to me in trouble, and I saved you. I answered you out of the thundercloud and tested your faith when there was no water at Meribah. Listen to me, O my people, while I give you stern warnings. O Israel, if you would only listen to me. You must never have a foreign god, and you must not bow down before a false god. For it was I, the Lord your God, who rescued you from the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it with good things. But my people wouldn't listen. Israel did not want me around. And so I let them follow their own stubborn desires, living according to their own ideas. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would follow me, walking in my paths. How quickly I would then subdue their enemies, but I would feed them with the finest wheat, and I would satisfy them with wild honey from the rock. So what happened when they failed? There are 3 results that I pulled out. There are other things that went through, but they failed to see another great miracle of God. And for us today, when we go through trials or when we are hitting that rut in our faith where it's really hard to come into his presence or hard to read his word, he has prepared a way, and we just need to seek and be patient. I think of, in God's view, how long he was waiting and excited to show them that he could provide from a rock in the wilderness, water that would solve all of their problems. And the answer was right there in front of them, but they refused to let him lead them. And then there was the failure to exemplify God's glory and holiness. This is brought out especially in what Moses did because he represented the mediator between God and man, but also in the people because they were God's chosen people. And when they sinned against God and when they failed to enter the promised land, then they fail also to show the glory of God and the holiness of God. And this last part is what the writer of Hebrews 3, when he discusses Psalm 95, is most concerned with. And it was the failure to enter the promises of God. Hebrews 3:19 says, we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. That experience that they had with God, it was all in their heads, but it never made it to their hearts. What is it that Pastor Ty says? It's like 8 inches between your head and your heart, and some people might miss heaven by 8 inches. It was easy to bring the people out of Egypt, and this is what it said a lot, but it was hard to take Egypt out of the people. It's like the all-nighter who is studying for a test and then fails a pop quiz over the same material later because they can't retain the information beyond that day. Every of those midnight owls knows that one night leads to another down the road. It has to be internalized to be applicable. So Hebrews 3:12 through 14 gives us then the warning and the solution to this last warning in Psalm 95. He says, be careful then, dear brothers and sisters, make sure that your own hearts are not evil and unbelieving, turning you away from the living God. You must warn each other every day while it is still today, or while it's still called today, so that none of you will be deceived by sin and hardened against God. For if we are faithful to the end, trusting God just as firmly as when we first believed, we will share in all that belongs to Christ. In 3:6, he is saying, hold fast to our confidence. He's saying later, take care because sin is deceitful. Do this for yourselves and then exhort others around you as long as it's called today. Protect yourself as well as helping others in protecting their lives. So how do we avoid a hardened heart? These things are brought out in the passage. The number one is obedience and avoiding of sin. Sin is anything contrary to what God says is good for us. He is our moral standard. He placed his Spirit in us, that still small voice, and then he gave us his word, the Bible. We must learn it, meditate on it, know it, and live it out. If you say yes to the small things, then you will learn to hear and obey the greater things. This is brought out in a message. It's kind of a pocket sermon that Pastor Tai has, that he preaches to the university students a lot, in looking at Daniel's life and his friends. And we remember them for the great things that they did. But the very first of their stories, there were very small steps that they took in obedience to God. It started with, we won't eat the same thing as the king eats because it's not prepared the right way that God told us to. Then it goes all the way up to, out of a whole crowd of the majority of people in the capital city, they're the only ones who don't bow down and have to go to the flames. And that takes a huge step of faith when everyone around you is kneeling down and you are standing for your faith. But it was because they said yes to those little things and they got used to saying yes to God. So it wasn't a problem for them when the greater things he asked them to do. And we want those greater things. We want to say, God, take me to the next step. But if we haven't said yes to the small things in our lives around us, how can he take us further and deeper in? So the second one is to remind others, ourselves and others, of what he has done and what he instructs us in his word. Ignoring or forgetting these things leads to the hardened heart. We face so many different trials. If we don't remember what the things that he's already brought us through, the things that he's already done, then we'll get into that next trial and we'll immediately think only about that trial. And back in Chi Alpha in the States, we had a time that we called white page. And we would all make this like symbol of tearing off a white page. It was the idea of a canvas, that you buy this nice new canvas. And I'm not an artist, so I would buy a canvas and I would prize it. I wouldn't actually use it. But imagine this big white canvas, and it had multiple sheets on it, or multiple ways that you could color. And one day, Gideon comes in with a marker, and he just starts scribbling all over it. Or he puts one dot in the center of that canvas. Now me, having prized my canvas, comes into the room. What is the first thing that I see? I focus on that one little dot or the one scribble on that page. If I would just tear that off, I would have plenty more to look at. If I didn't focus on that, I still have the whole white page that I could draw, or I could even make what he made into greater things. And that's the idea of reminding ourselves of the things that God has done. There's so much good, so much great things that he is doing and has already done, that this one thing in our life does not have to be our whole focus. If I focus on that dot, all of my vision will become black. But if I focus on the page, all of it would be white. All of it would be light. And number 3 is around the same idea, but it's filling our lives with him. Making his word and time with him a priority and value in every part of our journey with him. We can't know what is right and wrong without listening to him through his Spirit and his word. And I tell the students this often, that this time that you have right now, like right now in your lives, you can set those goals. You can start these habits. But if you don't set it now, it just gets more and more complicated. If you're in a job now, if you can take that time to set aside that time or figure out how much time you have to give. Maybe it's just 2 minutes here and 2 minutes there and 2 minutes there. Or maybe it's before bedtime or in the morning before you start your day. taking that time out to be with God, because if you don't start it, then it'll never become a part of your life. Hebrews 3:14 says, faithful to the end, meaning that trusting in him because of who he is, the unchanging God, and not wavering based on what happens in our life, but being faithful to him to the end because he is faithful to us. And I want to close today by looking back at this word today. Again, delay is not an option in this. It says today if you hear his voice, or today when you hear his voice. The past and his glory, the power, they're evident everywhere in creation. All we see speaks of him. And that's why I can say that I want to make him our Alpha and our Omega. If we see him as our Alpha, why not follow him to the end? Be faithful to him to the end. The future is not guaranteed, but today is available. And so if we could, those of you in the room, if you're online, you're watching, so you don't have to close your eyes, but everyone in the room, if you could bow your head and close your eyes. And I want to ask these two questions. One of them to those who are here or who are listening online. Is today the day that you want to start and choose to follow Jesus? Will you surrender your life to him and ask him for forgiveness of your failures and shortcomings? Sin is falling short of God's glory, going our own way in disobedience. But if you would say yes today, and for those of you here, would you raise your hand? Or those online, would you join in this prayer with me? This is the start of a new journey, a real relationship with your Creator. It's not just a one-time thing. And if you have responded and you join the prayer today, would you message, if you're watching online, either the pastors or a friend here, and let them know that you made this decision so we could celebrate and help you walk out this beautiful journey. For those who are here and those who already walk with Jesus, do you find in yourself today a heart that is totally responsive to the voice of God? Or would you be willing to lay your heart before Jesus, even as all of us as believers find our hearts hardened at times? Have you hit a rut in your life, or do you find his presence or his word to be something that is a chore rather than a joy? And every preacher can attest to the sermon speaking to them first. I've been there many times. The Bible seems dry or the journey dull, but it is not our fault. It's not the fault of the Bible or our journey or our Creator, but it's mine. I had started walking away and didn't even care to look around and realize my mistake. I started filling my life with the things of the world, and then the things of God started to look less appealing.